Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Professor Curtin mentioned, Brenda's already done something on fluoridation today, so he decided I would present the paper this afternoon, though both of us have worked on it. You'll see three really nice slides in here. Those are the ones Brenda did. The rest are mine. And I remember in my teaching evaluations one year, I got the truest comment that Dr. Stewart struggles with technology. So, and boy, that's a wise student, because there's no doubt about that. So, and Brenda and I became interested in a different aspect of leadership in Canada. There's lots of literature on leadership selection in Canada and on leaders. But what we found was that there was virtually nothing written about the exit of leaders from office. I should mention too that one of the distinctive factors about leadership selection in Canada, in terms of the activities of parties, is that policy conventions are virtually meaningless in all of the main parties. There's an occasional debate about policy, but nobody really feels bound in any way by the decisions that are made by parties in policy conventions. Really, the way political parties in Canada change a policy direction is to change the leader. So we have a very personalized leadership process, and policy is in a sense personalized as well. I wanted to say a bit about how Brenda and I got interested in this topic. We published in 2009 an article in Party Politics called Gender and Political Party Leadership in Canada. And it seemed a bit of a natural for us in that it combined really the two main research focuses that we have. I focus on leadership elections. Brenda focused on gender and politics, and we thought we could combine the two. Shortly after this was, well, a few years after it was published, the premier in the province in which we live, Alberta, Alison Redford, stepped down as premier relatively shortly after winning a provincial election. And we wrote an op-ed piece for the just the Globe and Mail. It's beyond Toronto, I guess, from its perspective, in which we talked about how Redford's tenure, this was their title for it, a familiar script for women in politics. She had one office with a relatively low leadership vote with very little support for caucus. She only survived for one election, and she was gone. But what struck us when we did that op-ed is that, there really wasn't a literature on why people leave. There had been some sort of studies about individual leaders, particularly among women in politics, but we decided we would try and focus on all of those who had left political office in Canada. And as you can see from the reference to Alison Redford, one of the things that we do to get enough cases to actually have an ability to draw some conclusions is that we combine the provinces and the federal government, which gives us about 30 different parties to look at. The provinces in Canada are highly significant political actors. They spend more money in their budgets in total than the federal government does. They raise more money. Their revenue sources are greater than the federal government. The turnout is, if anything, marginally higher in provincial elections than it is in federal elections. So there's no sort of first order and second order electoral difference in Canada. The provinces are pretty major political actors, and they are in no way subservient to the federal wing. So the provincial wing of a party is not in any way subservient to the federal wing of the party. That just doesn't exist in the Canadian system. The study of leadership selection and removal is obviously important given some of the trends that have been identified. The personalization of politics, the presidentialization of politics, and the increasingly powerful role that party leaders play in elections. I mean, I think in trying to follow party leadership more generally, I think we saw that in the most recent election here in New Zealand, when was it Andrew Little stepped down just before the election because they thought, well, he couldn't win the election, but a different leader could. So again, this notion that the leaders sort of transcend the party in terms of election results and hopes. One of the intriguing things about Canada, and this goes back actually to the 1800s, but I took a quote from the mid-20th century, is that Canadian parties are dominated by leaders, and the two strongest comparisons we make in Canada are with Britain and the United States. In both cases, it said we were stronger than the leaders have a more dominant role in Canada. I suspect that the notion of sort of party principles or program might apply more to the New Zealand and Australian examples as well. Canada has sort of stood out from the other Westminster parliamentary democracies on a number of dimensions relating to leadership selection. Again, leaders are the principal personalities in the democratic play now, as Cross and Blais concluded in a major comparative parliamentary study. And I think that the significance of leaders has become enhanced with the growth of primaries, which even New Zealand and Australia have lately become familiar with, although I'm intrigued that when Little stepped down, the Labour Party didn't feel the need to have another sort of primary. They just let the caucus choose a new leader. In the Canadian context, if any of you follow Canadian politics closely, just a couple of, or just over a month ago, the leader of the Conservative Party in our most populous province stepped down under allegations of sexual harassment. And the caucus decided, you know, it's only 3 months to the next election. We're going to choose the new leader. That lasted less than 24 hours because the outcry from the party was such that no, the members choose the leader, not the caucus. So they just concluded their primary on the weekend, and primaries are growing. So you can see that the Koenig study of 45 parties and 17 parliamentary democracies, 21 primaries, 12 party congresses or conventions, only 9 party caucuses. Work by Cross et al., comparative from 1975 to 2012. Primaries made up 0% in 75, 47% now. Party caucus has gone down from 25% to 10%. One of the things that brings up, and it's been quite significant in the Canadian context, is what is the relationship between the caucus and the leader if the caucus doesn't select the leader? Does the caucus have the right to remove the leader from office? And I guess a little bit about how leaders are removed in Canada. Until 1919, we had a pretty standard British Westminster model. The caucus chose the leader was gone when caucus wanted the leader to be gone. In 1919, we moved to a selection by a convention of party activists. That did two things in particular. First of all, it opened up the leadership to people who don't sit in the legislature. A lot of the leaders, people who become leaders of Canadian parties, aren't sitting members of the legislature for the party that they come to lead, which is a bit of a different element to the Canadian model. And it really changed the nature of the relationship between the leader and the caucus. There was no formal link then between selection and removal. Leaders disputed the right of caucus to remove them. In fact, they said quite specifically, you didn't choose me, you can't get rid of me. That left the Canadian parties in a very strange situation, and it took them 50 years to come up with a solution to that, which was a leadership review process that was held at a convention in which party convention goers were asked, do you want a leadership election to be held? So that gave us a formal way of getting rid of leaders. Since then, there have been all kinds of efforts to get rid of leaders via this process. But nonetheless, despite this sort of formal rule, informality rules in terms of getting rid of Canadian party leaders. Gruber et al., in a study of 100 parties in 14 countries over 50 years, found that about half the parties didn't have any rules for getting rid of leaders. It just sort of unfolded. Canada was one of the countries that did have those rulers, but since 1966, one person has lost a leadership review. So we have these wonderful formal rules for getting rid of leaders. Only one has ever been ousted that way. However, if you get below 70% of the vote in a leadership review, that's almost like losing. It's very difficult to stay in office, but 70% is there. Caucus, however, seems to retain an important role in the leadership process, even without possessing the formal power to depose leaders. Cross and Blais suggest that it's impossible really to stay in power if you don't have substantial caucus support. One of the intriguing things is they never define what substantial means. I think one of the things that we have found interesting in studying the removal of Canadian party leaders is sometimes they're sort of pushed out by only a handful of their caucus, even if they have the support of the majority. If there's reports that a handful are sort of against them, they're getting pushed towards the door. So a significant body of research examining questions of leadership selection, not a lot on removal. What we are looking at here are 175 departures of leaders selected to lead Canadian provincial and federal parties between January 1, 1980 and December 31st, 2017. And by the way, when I say Canadian parties, we only look at parties that have legislative representation. There are lots of parties that never elect anybody to the legislature. We're not paying attention to those in this examination. Just a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar with Canada, the population varies widely among the provinces, ranging, according to the 2011 census, from almost 13 million in Ontario, 8 million in Quebec, around 4 million in British Columbia and Alberta, and less than 1 million or just around 1 million in all of the other provinces. The other thing worth noting is up at the top there are 3 territories. Territorial leadership selection is not included in our study for 2 reasons. One, in 2 of the territories, they don't actually have political parties. So there's there's a vote by every member of the legislature to determine who the premier is, and there's no leader of the opposition as such in that context as well. Plus, the territories are in a very different constitutional situation. They don't have the powers that the provinces have, so they're not the same kind of significant political actors. We identified a number of relevant features from previous research, admittedly on a fairly small number of cases that we wanted to look at in terms of understanding leadership exits, the role the party plays in the system. Is it a major party, a government, or an opposition party that's capable of forming a government? Is it a minor party? They can elect members of the legislature, but really lightning strikes are more likely than them becoming a government. Ideology or party family, the notion that sort of more ideological parties have a different sort of relationship with their leaders than parties that are more pragmatic and power-focused. Temporal, has there been a change in the way leadership tenures or careers last? And the literature does suggest that tenures of leaders has been shortening over the last 50 years. Finally, and also we're interested in seeing if that's related to the move to primaries, although that's an element that we haven't really got to yet. And finally, about the differences in gender, which is what got us into this study in the first place. And there was mixed evidence there. Some of the international literature that's not very well theorized suggests there's not any differences in gender. But our previous work on Canada suggested that there might be. First of all, when did the leaders go? We tried to identify it. 16% of them resigned when their party was in power, which I guess is the ideal. You're in power and you just set it down. About half the leaders resign after losing an election. So they've led their party in an election, the party has lost, and they're gone. Actually, it's really 75% because another 23% not only lost the election, but they lost their own seat. And one of the things that's, I think, intriguing in the Canadian context here is that it shows that the electoral system matters for leadership selection. Because if a quarter of the leaders aren't winning their own seats, it's hard to hold on. The notion would be if it was more of a PR system, the leaders would be at the top of the list, and you would never have the situation in which a leader would be gone simply because they weren't returned to the legislature. That would be highly unlikely, and you would be. And finally, we found 19 leaders who never even made it to an election. They were chosen. Well, I guess I don't have to explain that. Andrew Little was an example of that here in New Zealand. Why did they go? And again, I guess the ideal for a leader is you decide on your own terms. You know, I've had enough. It's time to move on. I'd like to pursue other interests. Less than a third of the leaders are in that context. The second is in the aftermath of an election loss. And this is one that we have been working on because the way in which it's treated in the literature is a little different. Some people say up to a year after an election. We say, you know, if you're making the decision based on the election aftermath, a month. So if you've gone within a month, we're saying that you've departed in the aftermath of the election. In effect, the electorate has retired you rather than the party. Election loss and pressure, 28% of the leaders. Surprisingly, 8% of the leaders that have won an election and then are pressured to resign before the next election, in part because of maybe the party's not polling as well. There have been disputes within the party. Pushed out before an election, 6.3%. And the party folded. It's actually 5%. An example, in the creation of the Federal Conservative Party in Canada in 2003, two parties sort of died to create the new one, the Federal Progressive Conservatives and the Federal Alliance Party. So the leaders of those parties were gone as a result of that. A little bit on when and why combined. Did you exit in power? Well, you get a sort of 50-50 split. 50% of the leadership exits in power were made under their own, on their own terms, but fully 50% of the leaders in power were sort of pushed to the door by their party. And we define pressure as sort of either a very negative leadership review, which would be sort of under 70%, caucus defections, or calls by prominent members of the legislature or the party executive for the leader to step down. Exiting after an election loss immediately, which is in our definition within a month of the election. 23% under pressure, 41.4% on their own terms, 31%. Election loss and seat loss, again, a fairly high percentage of the leaders, immediately 50% roughly, and then another third under pressure, and a fifth on their own terms. And before contesting an election under pressure, 60%, and then about 20% either on their own terms or the death of the party. And so very different patterns. Focusing in on when losing leaders go, I think what we were intrigued by was the notion of resignation under pressure. And if you lose an election held onto your own seat, the pressure seems to be more intense for you to go. People who've lost the seat sort of see the writing on the wall and go. By the way, there are 4 government leaders in our study who lost their seat. So they won the election but lost their own seat. What happened in each of those cases is that a backbench member of the legislature stepped down, there was a by-election, and the government leader was returned successfully to the legislature. So even if you win the election, you can lose your own seat, but in all cases where that's occurred, the leader has got back into the legislature in a by-election. Number of contested elections, how long have you been leader before you go? Again, 11% didn't make it to an election contest. 50% contested only one election. So you're looking at 60% of the leaders, one election or less. That's a relatively short tenure as leader. 2 elections, 20%, and then 3 or more elections, about another fifth of the leaders. Exits and party status. Remember we talked about sort of the major and minor distinction is one of the elements highlighted in the literature. Major parties don't seem to make mistakes in the sense of pushing somebody out before an election. It's only 3% of the cases there versus 13% in the minor parties. The major party leaders contest 1.65 elections, 1.51 for the minor parties. The median days as leader don't appear terribly different on that score. Lost election in own seat, you can see the minor parties have a real problem in that context. By the way, some of the minor parties leaders who have the longest tenures were the only member of their party to secure election to the legislature. So there's certainly no possibility of a caucus challenge in that situation. And you want to replace the only person who's giving your party a legislative presence. Left on their own terms, 26% in the major parties, minor parties, higher ability to decide on their own. Post-election process or pressure, 41% for the major parties, 26% for the minor parties. Just a bit on the party families, and this is sort of the proxy for ideology. The right-wing populist parties, the Reform Party, the Alliance Party, the Saskatchewan Party, the Social Credit Party, those would all fit into that category. The Progressive Conservatives or the Conservatives, the Liberals, those are the two basic centrist parties, although some would quarrel with the Conservatives being in there, although the PCs were usually considered a centrist party. The NDP, which is the closest thing in Canada that exists to a Labour party. And then there are other left-wing parties, the Greens. But in the Canadian context, there are also two parties in Quebec that are sort of sovereigntist in orientation, the Parti québécois in provincial politics and the Bloc québécois in federal politics, and both of those are seen as sort of left-wing parties as well. You can really see the major party status is very common for the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives and the Conservatives, over 3/4 of the cases. For the NDP, roughly only 40% of the time are they a major party. And for the right-wing populists, also about 40%. The other left is boosted by the Parti québécois in Quebec, which is one of the two major contenders for power in that province. Number of elections, the New Democrats really stand out on this dimension. You see 7 of their leaders managed to contest 3 elections or more than 3 elections. That's almost half of the total leaders who fell into that category. The median days as leader, again, the NDP really stands out on this dimension with 2,262 days as leader. For the Conservatives, 1,279. For the Liberals, 1,412. So a lot more safety in the NDP party, and that's perhaps both related to the increased minor party status, but also some attributed, and we'll be looking at this in the future, as to whether that's more ideological, that the Labour or more left-wing parties sort of don't put this much focus on the leader, so there's less of an incentive to get rid of a leader after a poor election term. And the NDP was also the party that had the most leaders leave on their own terms, 50%. The Conservatives, 23.3%. There was a term in Canada around the Conservative leadership that was called the Tory syndrome, which was focused on the Tories getting rid of anybody who couldn't win an election. It was seen as a very insecure position. Pressure also lowest among the NDP, highest in the Conservatives, with the Liberals falling in between. So party family does seem to have an impact on these dimensions. The category was the change over time, and trying to just decide which. If you get 175 cases, dividing it into the time periods, you start losing cases quickly. I think one of the most interesting things is the 1980 to 1989 period, because that was really before primaries. There's only 2 of the 47 leaders in that group that were chosen by primaries. The other 45 were all chosen in conventions, and they seem to last a bit longer in terms of the mean elections contested. This was also a point at which getting rid of somebody before an election was less common. Only 4%. More recently, the mean elections contested seems to have gone down. It's the elections after 2000. It's notably lower than it was prior to that. And again, you can see that in the median days, 2142 in the first period, and then down by a third at a minimum in any of the other additional periods. So tenures seem to be growing shorter over time. The pressure, the patterns are not as clear. It seems to be more, the leaving under their own terms, probably around a third in the first 2 periods and about a quarter in the second in the 2 latter periods. So there is a change, but it doesn't seem to be that dramatic. Although obviously the 2010 period is the smallest. But again, we're only looking at people whose terms have come to an end, right? So obviously you can't categorize the exits of people who are still there. The final portion of our study that I wanted to talk about is really what got us into this question, which was sort of gender and leadership exit. You can see with the highlights and the nice lines, these are not the tables that I did in this area. So days as leader and elections contested, you see a pretty dramatic difference of 400 days as leader between men and women, and a third of an election between men and women. But what's more striking is when you make the distinction between major and minor parties, because in the minor parties, the women's tenure has actually been longer than that of the men, and they've contested on average more elections. But if you look at the major parties, the men last almost twice as long in terms of the number of days, and contest the 2/3 of an election more on average than the women do, which has got us into a nice literature dealing with the situation in which women are selected as leaders, and how that affects the term. Things like the glass cliff, which Brenda has been working on in the context of these exits. Secondly, the contested elections by gender and party type. First of all, you see that the women in the major parties are more likely to contest no elections than men by about a factor of 2/3. And we have 4/5 of the women leaders who've contested 1 or fewer elections, compared to 56% of the men. And in the more than 3 elections, roughly 10% of the men, 0% of the women. And just as an aside, Canada has yet to have a woman leader who has won 2 elections. So we've had a number who've been elected, led their party to victory in 1 election, but none of them have been re-elected. Came close in British Columbia a year ago when the Liberals won 0.08% more of the popular vote, but they didn't make it through to winning a vote of confidence in the legislature. The minor parties don't display nearly as much of the difference. So again, there's an interaction between the minor parties and the major parties, and we think that's one of the things that's led a number of scholars to conclude, there's not really as much of a gendered impact on leadership tenures and leadership exits, because if you just look at the overall numbers, they are less compelling than they are when you distinguish major and minor parties out in that context. We do have, in this case, however, a number of women who've contested 2 or 3 elections that you're able to that we focused in other analysis. Leadership exits, when and why. Exit while in power, under pressure. There are 3 women. All of them have been effectively left office under pressure. For men, it's about half and half. And the exit after an election in which you've lost your seat, under pressure, 80% of the women, 40% of the men. And it's worth noting that this is limited to major parties. Here, we're not looking at the minor parties in this context, just the major parties. Left after an election in which you lost your own seat, no clear pattern. Before contesting an election, again, not big numbers, but more likely for the women to be pressured before an election than the men. And by the way, the woman who left on her own terms developed breast cancer. So it wasn't the kind of deciding to go on to do to pursue other interests in that context. On the other hand, women tend not to lead parties that die, which is because the parties that have folded or merged have all been led by men. I don't think there's actually much to that element. Finally, just a few reflections. In Canada, careers are short. I think that's going to become an increasingly widespread, particularly where primaries are growing. Most end in failure. Surprisingly, people go after they lose an election. Relatively few go while they're in power. Relatively few end voluntarily. Most people are either pressured out or leave after losing an election in which the electorate has effectively rendered a vote of non-confidence. The exits are affected by party status. The minor and major distinction is highly significant. Party family, the NDP, provides more security, although we need to break that down further to determine whether it's sort of ideology or party status. Because remember I said only one person had ever been ousted in a leadership review. That was the previous federal leader. And that was an interesting case in which the New Democrats, for the first time, I think, thought they had a realistic shot at winning the government. And I thought that plays up this nature between ideology and party status quite nicely, because their leader, Thomas Mulcair, was seen as a kind of centrist and pragmatic figure. And he was saying, you know, if you elect me, maybe we'll win the election. So if you sort of hold on or swallow your principles and elect a pragmatic politician, and then he loses, he's not in a very enviable situation. If you're going to lose, you might as well lose with somebody who is going to give better voice to your principle. Gender, women have shorter tenures, contest fewer elections, and are more likely to exit under pressure. I think primary selection may matter, and that's a variable that we're now going back and adding into our data set. Because one of the things, if you're selected in a primary, you don't have the same kind of internal resources to bring to your defense when pressures arise. You might have been elected by only really modest support within the party elite. And it's hard to rely on members to sustain you in position when times get more troubled. And finally, the electoral system, we argue, matters because of the single member plurality system's propensity for having leaders who are defeated and don't make it to the actual legislature. I think we would hypothesize from that being pressured out is actually going to be more intense in a more PR-oriented system than it is in the single-member plurality system, because in SNP, sometimes the electorate does your work for you in getting rid of the leader. So thank you for your attention. Brenda will be happy to respond to any questions that you have.